So we'll wait to see if we get anyone else up on stage. I think Cheesy's probably going to represent the data working group, and I caught up with Wolfgang. So if Wolfgang can't make it, I'll give an update on the ML working group side, uh, and we'll kind of go from there. Okay, cool. I'm going to get started. So we have a couple of updates on the organization. There's kind of a lot going on from like a logistical administrative perspective that may not be super exciting, but want to give everybody kind of like the full visibility. Last week, we presented a proposal to the Linux Foundation's AI and data group. The proposal was to move under that umbrella of projects, specifically underneath the Generative AI Commons umbrella. That was accepted unanimously, so we have made that shift. It's a really, I would say, maybe big deal from just the amount of resources that we're going to have within the Linux Foundation, some of which is already kind of getting started. The team that's supporting us right now is both connecting us with the Linux Foundation's AWS contact, which effectively they have a relationship with AWS. The Linux Foundation has a lot of support from AWS. They have the kind of a relationship where projects underneath that open source umbrella can get compute and resources that are effectively just credits that are coming from AWS. They do a lot of support there. The first goal is to get provisioned compute and kind of just general support services for getting the data curation application up. The data working group team can give an update on that. But then the second order conversation for them is going to be the extent to which they can provide a larger amount of compute to run the training process. So that's going to be an ongoing conversation. In the meantime, we have a lot of, I would say, resources to provide for testing. Wolfgang has started to leverage compute to run and test the training code. Invoke is going to be allocating compute that we had originally been aligned with another internal project supporting Flux control net development. We're moving that compute over to support this initiative. So Wolfgang will be leveraging that compute once it is ready to start testing. And the intent of that is going to, again, be validating some of the hypotheses we have around control inputs in the kind of foundational architecture. I think one of the things that I've observed in testing some of the control nets that have come out for Flux is that it is probably going to be harder to get high quality results without some amount of experimentation and testing. The control nets for Flux really do struggle quite a bit with certain image domains, and they're still early. And some of that is going to be an open question around, is that just foundationally a challenge in moving architectures, or is there, is the main limiting factor the amount of compute that has gone into training control nets to date? Both could be valid. I think it is significantly more compute intensive to train control nets for Flux, given the size of the model. And so there's probably a lot of testing and validation we need to do on our side. But I think it exposes the benefits of having a smaller model, in the sense that the community can move forward on certain things like sidecar models and experimentation on research much more quickly if the model's more accessible. So I think there's a lot of interesting learnings there, but the machine learning research group will be putting some time and effort into testing and validating how we can get control baked in at a very foundational level. I think the hope is that the compute for the data curation app will be provisioned in the next few weeks. We still have to get that conversation. I'm going to try to see if we can optimize that for a nearer term deployment. I think that's going to really be dependent on the conversation with AWS. But we'll keep everybody updated as that gets relayed. The other thing that I mentioned is that the Linux Foundation AI and Data Group is resourcing us with kind of additional, I would say, general organizational support. So the team that's supporting us right now is putting together a full project for website development. So the OMI will have the website live and available at openmodel.foundation. The website also will kind of coincide with a general rebranding of the OMI in the sense of like better visual content, logo redesign, all that kind of stuff. I think it's more of like a full project identification rebrand, which I think is going to be. It's not going to change the name or anything that we're doing. It's more so just giving us a more professional presence on the web, which will be nice. I think the ask from them is going to be what content we want to put together for the site. If we have the app up, I think that'll be like a part of the site. It would be like rerouted. If we don't have that, we may just need to think about what we want the website to have from a content perspective. For the working group members, I'll throw together a Google Doc and we can align on that content. And I'll share that out once I have a little bit of insight, hopefully today, on the timeline for AWS. So those are general announcements and updates for the organization. We'll continue to kind of move things forward. For maybe Cheesy or Fearn, do you guys have any updates that you want to share from the data working group side?
Yeah, I can give a brief update there. So we're continuing to work on our various. You can hear me, right?
Yep, can hear you.
We're continuing to work on our various parallel initiatives. So for one, we're working on the OMI data pipeline website, which we're going to initially use to collect the HDR images. The authentication rewrite I mentioned last time has been completed and merged in. Required a little more it still requires a little more cleanup of the previous work, just remove old code and stuff, and we've had to do a few bug fixes, but that's coming along very well. We're also getting closer to the completed image upload user experience. However, that was slowed down as we're kind of, as mentioned, we're waiting for some Amazon credits to support the S3 bucket that would initially hold those images before review. We've also completed a little more safety work there, such as being able to quickly turn off the image upload feature without needing any code changes or anything in case a problem arises. Um, we're also still working to continuing to internally collect more HDR images data ourselves. And then, Vern, would you like to talk a little bit about your VLM setup work and how you're progressing there?
Yeah, so we currently have an active branch out there for captioning service, looking at uh, different configurations that we can fit on the hardware credits that we have available. So right now I have it set up so that we can launch on RunPod with Pixtrol and Quen with some custom Docker images there. Um, and also looking at a few other flows so we can do some offline inference. So if we have a large batch and we have some resources that are only available locally, we can do some sort of upload there. Uh, Also, right now, looking at this new ARIA model that dropped this morning and seeing what hardware we can run that on, since it's a MOE, it should be able to batch process things pretty quickly. So it might be a good option for us for some better quality captions, since it kind of performs at that Quinn 72B level.
And
That's mainly
is
what's
the
going on. But yeah, go ahead.
so some questions for you on the captioning flow. A, I guess from a repository perspective, are we putting that in the data pipeline repository as kind of like a utility that people could download and use, or like what is the flow that people are going to be able to use that captioning pipeline?
Yep.
Um,
So it is it's its own module, and it'll have its own pip install, so you can install just that module.
cool.
And it'll primarily focus on using VLLM is what we're looking at, since we know that we're going to do lots of batching. I want to take advantage of that capability inside of VLLM, and it seems like they're kind of on the front of being able to run a lot of these multimodal models. That does constrain a little bit to requiring CUDA and GPU to work well. We might be able to expand that in the future, but that seems to be a reasonable constraint for right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, they would be able to run it with offline batch inference with that.
Excellent. And
Uh,
from community members who want to like participate and use their compute to support the captioning efforts. Is the intent, and this is partly, I think, a question just to kind of like expose this type of discussion in the all hands. I think I know the answer, but I just want to expose it. Is the intent that people can run this and participate and upload those captions using the data curation application website?
Yes. At the bare minimum, the MVP will be a export of the captions to some sort of a Parquet file that can be uploaded and then reviewed. But we can explore other options for that as well in the future too.
Got it. And from the data perspective, just thinking about the logistics here, the data sets that are getting captioned, is this going to be something where users are downloading a significant amount of data from wherever these images are uploaded in S3? Is that the process that we're thinking about here?
So I think that would be that kind of maybe Cheesy. You can talk a little bit more about the download process, but
Yeah, I would think so. We might need some more discussions here, but
Yeah.
my understanding was for the HDR images themselves, they're going to be only in the S3 before we review them. Once we reviewed them, if we're able to keep up with the amount, we would be running a VLM on the back end to basically automatically process these HDR images, also to give them annotations just for additional benefit there. But to actually make these HDR images public for people, it will be, once they get reviewed, they'll be getting pushed up to a Hugging Face dataset. So that is where these ones that we're hosting ourselves will be available. In terms of if we're going to get people to help with other captioning work, it's likely that we won't want to host those images ourselves still. Like in an S3 bucket, it would be ones from either URLs that are available elsewhere or Hugging Face datasets. And that would be more of the flow there, where people would either submit just here's a Hugging Face dataset that's very interesting and we want it to be processed, and we can kind of batch process that on the back end, slowly work our way through it, or be
so
able
one
to go,
thing.
here is the dataset with our captions as well provided. Sorry, go ahead, Fern.
Oh, sorry. One thing that is possible too. So obviously, if they want to load things down locally and do the captions there, actually, that's not true. So a lot of the times you can feed in the URLs directly to these things, and it can run off of those. So theoretically, we could just feed them into the system as the URLs, and they would not need to download them. Obviously, you still run into all the other issues with if they're missing URLs and stuff like that. But I think you could potentially bypass the problem of having to download them locally, just with some of the tools that they have for some of these BLM pipelines.
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
the only consideration is if we process the annotation ourselves, it doesn't necessarily need manual review. If we're accepting community contributions there, it may require additional manual review just to make sure no one's trying to poison the data set or that kind of thing. So there'll be some considerations to that aspect as well.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think we probably just want to think about these pipelines only because I think we want to be as respectful as possible. Um, uh, Pulling data from external sources, like if we're going to the URL and pulling it down, I think having an army of people hit that and pull it down may be seen as unfriendly, and we don't want to be that. But I'm also thinking if at any point images are going to be pulled from S3, S3 might be the wrong place to be hosting those, namely because of egress. And I know that there are S3 compatible APIs with Cloudflare, and R2 is kind of like seen as the place that you want to be hosting a lot of data if it's going to be significantly like trafficked. So I raise all of that just to highlight thinking about what the data pipeline looks like. Obviously, if it's on Hugging Face or if the data doesn't have to be downloaded somehow, I think there's some interesting opportunities there. But we should just think about what that proposed pipeline looks like to make sure that when we turn this on, we're as respectful as possible of all of the various resources that we're partnering with. And
Yep,
then just
for
from a
sure.
compute perspective. Okay, cool. I think that is that everything from the data working group side?
I believe so. I was just going to mention a reminder, our data pipeline project is public on GitHub for anyone who wants to follow along that work more closely. But
Very cool.
that's all for us this time.
Sweet. And I gave, I think, the update on the machine learning working group side. Vlad, is there anything that you wanted to bring up from an agenda perspective?
No, not really. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
One maybe recurring comment, just as we look at quantization formats in the ecosystem, still keeping an eye on that. I don't know that there's been any type of consolidation that I can see on quantization formats, but I do know that GGUF is increasingly, at least has been cited as a format. I'll note that Invoke's implementation for bringing those down and actually leveraging GGUF, it's open source. I just reference it because I think it might be an interesting approach, and it seems a simpler way to leverage GGUF models than some of the implementations that we've seen in the past. So I'll just raise that up as a check it out for other UI developers if you all are looking for at least a new approach or our approach to leveraging GGUF. On last agenda item note, I'm speaking with a team called Rapidata, which is a startup. I think they're out of Switzerland. They put together a preference data set using Flux, and their product is effectively putting that in front of human users on mobile phones as part of kind of like a standard ML data acquisition pipeline. But they did this research where they did kind of preferencing between various Flux models as well as Flux versus other popular image generators. And that preference data is something that I'm talking about with them later today. I believe they're willing to open source that underneath the open OMI. So we'll have a very large preference data set that is relatively high quality. And I do think that that will be a very useful resource for research. And so excited to kind of share more about that once I talk with them later today. The goal would be to effectively open source it under a CDLA2 license and make that available in the OMI. That is like a question from the group. That is the right company. That is it. Rapidata.ai. Their research, I can put a link to that in the chat as well momentarily. I think the takeaway from the research, though, is that Flux is kind of preferred over most everything else. They also did a recent paper that showed that the Flux 1.1 Blueberry update that they released, which is a lot quicker, is actually less preferred than the original Pro model. So some amount of quality or preference loss was ultimately realized when they made it more efficient. But I put the archive paper in around testing between Flux, Midjourney, DALL-E, and Stable Diffusion. I think it's an interesting approach from a preference perspective. They have both like preference, which image do you prefer, coherence, which image is more like realistic looking, and then which image better reflects the caption. So they have 3 different types of data that they've collected, and that preference data, as everybody knows, is extremely valuable perspective to have, and the way that they've pulled that together, I think, could be really, really interesting. Mainly, we'll be talking to them today about the perspectives on how it needs to be structured and how we can make that available in a clean way for everybody to use. Question was, is this only synthetic data? I believe the answer is yes. I believe that's all preference data that's synthetic in nature. I can double check that, but I believe that's correct. Yeah, I think I'm looking at the paper right now. I think it is purely synthetic data, which is still useful for preference alignment and kind of DPO stuff. So I think it'll still be a very useful tool. Another open source preference data set was, I think, the Pick-a-Pick preference data set, and that was what the original DPO paper was based on. So synthetic data is still extremely useful for preference optimization, and I think ultimately getting better at using synthetic preference data is ultimately going to help us build better models, because that's going to be the easiest way to generate data in mass. And I think we really want to be able to use synthetic data better in the long term for model quality. So this data set's, I think, going to be pretty useful. Someone asked about releasing the OMI model without aesthetic fine tuning. I think the intent is to release the model at all stages, including alpha stages, so that people can follow along, and definitely give access to kind of the raw output of like the pre-train, the 256 by 256 images, releasing it after we scale that and have the full kind of full baked alpha model in. I think that's the goal, is to be very open with the process. Right now, I think the biggest blocker is really just having all of this stuff live and running, and that's going to take a little bit of compute. So that's what we're working on right now. Cool. I'll leave the floor open for additional questions, but then we can call this a concluded all hands, and take it away. Someone cited that they are happy to be able to see the intermediate training stages. I think this will be, yeah, maybe different than most other training processes where you get the final result. I think the intent is for this to be very open so that we can kind of learn and expose that training process for the benefit of everyone to understand that. Somebody said, one thing I've noticed with FluxDev is that it seems to be better at realistic subjects, while SDXL and 1.5 tend to be better at generating weird stuff. I do think that's true, and I do believe that's a matter of the data set that Flux was trained on, but I think it's also important to recognize that we're at a point with SDXL and 1.5 where those are mature, or at least relatively more mature ecosystems where they have a lot of fine tunes. Flux is such a large model that I think the number of fine tunes that we're seeing is much smaller. And ultimately, I think it is a more, just from using it, it seems to be a more hyper-specific model, in the sense that, like, if you train it to do a thing, it's going to do that thing really, really well. And it maybe is a little bit, it's kind of a little bit like, I don't want to say overfit, but it just gets very, very specific at what you train it to do. It's a little fussy, is what some people are describing it as. Yes, and I think that's right. I think we still probably are figuring out Flux. I think that's the way that I would describe the broader ecosystem. I personally had a conversation with our team earlier today about the control nets that are available for Flux, and the control nets themselves are, I would say, first generation control nets for this ecosystem for Flux. They're not as mature as the SDXL control nets, especially when you're dealing with non-photorealistic or like non-standard subject matter. It can be very difficult to get like the quality that you would expect out of Flux, at least at very high control net strengths, which is, I think ultimately there's two flavors of control net usage. There's, I just want this to be generally in this shape or composition, and then there is, I want this to be exact. I'm using this for like architecture. I'm using this as a sketch, as an artist, and I want it to be true to my sketch and still produce something useful. And I think we're not quite there yet for Flux control nets. There's still a little bit more testing to do, but the combination of training it on domain data that is useful to you as well as having the control, I think, is still in progress. And I think we're still learning a little bit about that model. But I do think it helps. It helps in shaping how we approach the OMI model and understanding how the shift in architecture has made it stronger in certain circumstances and maybe a little bit less flexible in others. The goal again with the OMI is to build a very powerful applied model in the sense that it is designed for the applications that we see people leveraging in the world. And that part of that is control. And so the dream is alive on continuing to improve that. And I think the testing that Wolfgang is starting to do and will continue to do will hopefully realize, some significant and market improvements on that dimension. Someone asked a question, will the training of the model use EMA? If so, can we also expect to see the EMA weights at different stages of training? Having this information might enable merging approaches that are not really possible with current available models. I will say that it is still, all of the training plans are being finalized and kind of what we can and are able to share at various points. Some of these decisions are still not final as far as like architecture. So we're at a stage right now where we're still making some decisions on the architecture, and I don't think that a number of things are finalized yet. So I don't want to speak too soon. I've noticed that if I speak too soon on anything, I am roasted and crucified publicly for doing so. So I'm going to be a little bit less, speculative here than I would otherwise be, and just kind of leave it at that. I do know that the goal is anything that we provide or anything that we're using as much as possible being open. And that is the plan as it stands right now. I think there are some like real world limitations that we'll have to take into account and may restrict what we can share, but insofar as we can provide it, we will be trying to provide it. So I don't know that that answers your question directly, but I'll say that if we can share those, we will during the process. Okay, cool. I think that answers all of the current open questions. Excited to continue to doing this with everybody. I know that we've got a lot of things changing in the world right now, but I am glad to be working with this group of people pushing this forward. So we'll go ahead and call it a close for today. And I thank everyone for attending and for the data working group and ML working group on continuing to push it forward. Take care, everybody. See you soon.